Hi, fifth graders. Today we're going to talk about three different words. There's three different types of living things. We're going to talk about producers, consumers, and decomposers. Let's get started. The first word is producer. Let's say it 3 times. Make sure you're saying it with me. Producer, producer, producer. In a sentence, you might see, the most common example of a producers are plants. The definition of a producer is any organism that produces their own food and oxygen with energy from the sun. Generally, these are plants, but not always, and we'll see a little bit more about that when we do examples. Here are some examples of producers. Of course, trees and grasses are on here as they're both examples of plants. However, there are some other small things, a lot of them are small, that can create its own food. Algae is something that will be forming in a more wet environment, often like water or the ocean. Algae is a producer, and you can tell that it kind of is a plant-like because of its green color. We know that chloroplasts are only found in plant cells, and they cause that green color. Another example of something that can create its own food is called phytoplankton, which are really, really small organisms that will often be found in oceans and water. So phytoplankton is another thing that can create its own food. Seaweed is a plant, but it's one that you don't often think about because it's below the surface of the water usually. So seaweed is another producer. The tricky parts about producers, there's a handful. Number one, that it's not just plants. Kids always forget about phytoplankton and algae. I don't know why. Secondly, it has a synonym that you may see instead. You may see the word producer. You also might see the word autotroph. Autotroph has two parts. The first part, auto, right here, means self. Troph means feeder. So autotroph is a self-feeder or an animal that makes its own food. Another thing that a lot of kids get confused about is that they think that plants make food for other organisms. So, oh, the grass is making food for the rabbit. No, the plant is making food for itself so that it can survive. It just happens that the rabbit is eating it too. And the final thing that can cause a little bit of confusion is that producer is a homonym. So we talk about producers in science when we're talking about a plant or something that creates its own food. However, the word producer can also mean a person who creates something. So maybe there's a producer of the shirt that you're wearing or the person that sells it. That means something a little bit different than the scientific definition. All right, it is your turn. Remember to use a complete sentence. Remember to use read and write if you can to say the sentence aloud. If not, it's fine to type it. One example of a producer is, give me one. Go. All right, moving on. Next thesaurus, consumer. Let's say the word 3 times. Consumer, consumer, consumer. In a sentence, you might see, secondary consumers get their energy directly from primary consumers. We will be talking more about secondary, primary, and even tertiary consumers in the weeks coming along, but we're not there quite yet, so let's get there together. The definition of a consumer is anything that eats plants or other plant-eating animals. You could also say that this is anything that was not a producer because they don't make their own food, so they have to get it from somewhere else. And obviously, one example of a consumer are little bunny rabbits. In my words, it's anything that needs to eat to get energy. It's not necessarily only things that eat producers. They don't only eat plants. They either eat plants or they eat something else that ate the plants. And that's a sad picture, but I wanted to show you that it applied to meat eaters too. The tricky parts about consumer, it also has a homonym. And in fact, when we're talking about goods and services, so like I used to work at a grocery store, we had producers that would give us the things that we would sell, but the consumer is the person who would buy the goods from us. Those two words went together. Producer and consumer go together in science, but in science, it's people or organisms that make their food versus the things that eat the organisms that make the food. So they're kind of linked in both cases, which makes it especially tricky. However, it is your turn. One consumer is blank. Full sentence, use the word, go. All right, moving on. The final word is decomposer. It's got a lot of syllables there. Decomposer. Say the word 3 times. Decomposer, decomposer, decomposer. In a sentence, you might see, When a plant and animal die, they become food for decomposers like bacteria, fungi, and earthworms. The definition of a decomposer is an organism that breaks down dead plants and animals into useful nutrients for the soil. Here are some examples of decomposers. They include mushrooms, and you'll notice here specifically this mushroom is growing on a dead log. So it's taking that dead tree and breaking it down back into soil. Obviously, this is an earthworm. They'll break things into soil components. What you're seeing here is mold, and this is mold on some fruit. And it's kind of hard to see, but these are lemons that are getting broken down by this mold plant or these mold spores. And then finally, some types of bacteria are also decomposers and break things down. The most tricky thing and the most arguments that I get into with kids has to do with a similar word. So a lot of kids already know what a scavenger is. A scavenger is an animal that eats dead stuff. So for example, you might see a turkey vulture on the side of the road eating some roadkill. He's a scavenger. However, he's not a decomposer. So I found a little chart that had some of the differences between scavengers and decomposers. Scavengers are animals that feed on dead plants and animals and other carrion. They've got a scientific name. They are mainly animals. That's one of the key differences. So scavengers, if they look like animals, they're probably not decomposers. They consume dead plants, animals, and carrion, but they break down organic materials, aka dead stuff, into just smaller pieces. Some examples of scavengers are birds, crabs, insects, worms. We talked about turkey vultures as well. On the other hand, decomposers are generally not necessarily animals, they're things that are smaller than that. So you may see earthworms, fungi, or bacteria. And the key thing, the key difference is that decomposers break small pieces of organic material into molecules that go back into the soil. So they break things down even smaller than scavengers. Scavengers might be small pieces. Decomposers break it back down into the molecules that are needed to make the soil healthy. We absolutely need decomposers. They're super necessary because without that, the next cycle of plants could not start growing to start the food web all over again. We'll talk a little bit about that next week as well. It is your turn. One example of a decomposer is, all right, go for it. Okay, I hope that you have a wonderful day. As I've said many times before, you are terribly missed. Please know that. I love you and I hope to see you soon. Bye.